In this video, we're going to explore mix and yield variances. Mix and yield variances are simply an extension of our standard quantity variances from the earlier chapter. The alternative or variation in this problem is that instead of having one type of direct materials, we have two types of direct materials. We're using both C30 and D12 to produce our finished product. Our actual production during the period was 100,000 units. Let's go ahead and fill out our direct material variance chart. Let's begin with our standard quantity allowed. We'll be allowed 60,000 standard gallons of C30. That's the 100,000 units we produce at 0.6 of a gallon per unit. Our standard price is $5 per gallon. And then our actual quantities, we actually used 55,000 gallons at an actual price of $5.20 per gallon. In terms of our variances, we will have an unfavorable price variance because our actual price of $5.20 was greater than our standard price of $5. We will have a favorable quantity variance because we only used 55 gallons of C30, and we would have expected to use 60,000 gallons of C30 to make our 100,000 units or gallons of output. Our total variance then is going to be the difference between our actual cost of C30 and our standard allowed of 300,000. So our total variance is $14,000, and it's favorable because the actual cost was less than our standard allowed. Finishing off then, our center number is 275,000, which is our actual quantity, times our standard price. We have a total price variance of $11,000 and a total quantity variance of $25,000. Our price variance again could have been found by taking the 55,000 gallons multiplied by the 20 cents per gallon difference in price. Our $25,000 quantity variance can be found by taking the 5,000 additional gallons less gallons multiplied by the standard price of $5 per gallon. What we're going to do now is we want to explain our total quantity variance, in this case of $25,000. And the $25,000 quantity variance is the difference between the actual quantity at standard price, the $275, and the $300,000, which is our standard quantity allowed. So we're going to be working on calculating that $25,000 difference. Find out how much of it was due to a mix variance and how much of it was due to a yield variance. So here's our setup. And again, we want to explain the difference between our actual quantity at standard price, the $275, and the $300,000. Recall we had a total quantity variance of $25,000. To calculate our mix and yield variance, we take our actual standard quantity allowed, which is our actual standard quantity. That's our 104,000 actual gallons that we used of raw materials, multiplied by our 0.6 per gallon ratio, or 6% is what we would have used. Or rather, 60% of that usage we would have expected to have been for material C30. So we have 104,000 multiplied by 0.6 to give us the 62,400. We're going to multiply that by our standard price, which was $5 per gallon, to get a total of $312,000. Now we can calculate our mix and our yield variance. Our mix variance is the difference between the 312,000 and the 275. And again, since our actual is less than our actual quantity multiplied by the standard price, we have a favorable mix variance. Our yield variance is going to be $12,000, and it is unfavorable. Notice we have an unfavorable yield variance because we used 104,000 total gallons, where we would have expected at standard to only have used 100,000 gallons. Another way at looking at our yield variance, or rather our mix variance, is that we can see that originally we would have expected 60% 0.6 out of the 1. 60% of our materials would have been for C30, but it actually turned out to be 55,000 divided by 104, or 52% of our direct materials were C30, while the other 47% was D12. So again, we have an unfavorable yield variance because we should have used 100,000 times 1 gallon in total materials, 100,000 gallons to produce our product, but it required 104, so we've got an unfavorable yield variance. But from a mix perspective, we only used 55,000 gallons of C30, where at standard we would have expected, if we used 60% of our materials were of C30, we would have expected 62,000 gallons. Our mix percentage went from 60%, 0.6 out of 1, to 52%. Please go ahead and pause the video and go ahead and complete the quantity variances for material D12. The first step is to calculate, recall, our standard quantity allowed. We produced 100,000 gallons of output. 40% of our raw materials would have been expected to be material D12, so our standard quantity allowed would have been the 0.4 times 100,000, or 40,000 gallons. In terms of actual quantity and our actual price, we paid $14 per gallon. For an actual of 49,000 gallons is what we purchased and used. Our standard price was 15, and so then we can go ahead and talk about our variances. Our price variance would be favorable since our actual price was less than our standard price. Our quantity variance would be unfavorable because our actual quantity of 49,000 units is greater than our 40,000 standard allowed. Let's go ahead and calculate our total variance. Our actual quantity or actual price of our raw material D12 is $686,000, and again that's given, and that's our actual quantity times our actual price. Our standard quantity allowed, 600,000, so our total variance is going to be unfavorable since our actual cost of $686,000 is $86,000 more than the standard allowed. Going ahead and calculating our price and our quantity variances, we multiply out actual quantity times standard price to get 735,000. Our price variance is 49,000, and again that was favorable. Our quantity variance was 135,000, and again that was unfavorable. Once again, if you haven't done so, go ahead and pause this video so you can calculate your mix and yield variances. And again, our goal is to explain our total $135,000 unfavorable quantity variance, which again was the difference between the 735 and the 600,000 standard quantity allowed. So that's our starting point for our mix and yield variances. Our first step is to fill out our center column. Our standard price for material D12 was $15 per gallon. Based on a 40% or 0.4 gallons out of our total 104, so 0.4 times 104, we would have expected out of 104,000 gallons of raw materials that 40% of that, or 41,600, would have been for D12 as a raw material. Multiplying those two together, we get 624,000. So our mix variance is $111,000. And again, it is unfavorable because we have used more of D12 in our mix than we would have anticipated. Originally, from a mix perspective, we expected 0.4 out of every 1 gallon, or 40% of our usage, to be for material D12. It turned out that 47% of our raw material input was D12. Notice, if you recall, we had a favorable mix variance for C30, and we will then, by analogy, have an unfavorable one for D12. In terms of our yield variance, again, just like for C30, we have an unfavorable yield variance because we should have used 100,000 gallons of total input, 1 gallon of input per gallon of output, or 100,000, and we actually used 104. And the two unfavorable variances combined together to give us our $135,000 total unfavorable variance.